Have you ever really thought about the rapture? You know, that super dramatic image of people suddenly just vanishing into thin air? Well, today, we're going to dig into an analysis that asks a pretty fascinating question. Is this idea an ancient biblical prophecy, or is it actually something much, much more recent?
So that's the big question we're tackling. Is the version of the rapture that we all know from books and movies really rooted in ancient scripture, or did it pop up a lot closer to our own time? Let's dive right in and unpack the theory itself.
All right, first things first, let's make sure we're all on the same page. To really get what the critique is all about, we have to start with the popular, mainstream version of the rapture theory, the one a lot of us can probably picture right now.
You know the scene, right? Cars suddenly become driverless, planes start falling out of the sky, people's clothes are just left in a pile where they were standing. The whole idea is that believers get taken away before some awful period of suffering kicks off on Earth. So, where did this very specific, very dramatic scenario come from?
Okay, so this verse from 1 Thessalonians, this is often the go-to scripture, the main piece of evidence cited to back up the theory. That key phrase is caught up. But according to the analysis we're following, it's the interpretation of that phrase where all the confusion really gets started.
So if the interpretation is the key, then where on earth did this specific interpretation, the one about a pre-tribulation vanishing act, actually come from? Well, this analysis traces it not to ancient times, but to the 1800s.
And according to our source, it all points to this guy, John Nelson Darby. He was an English clergyman back in the 19th century, and he's identified as the main architect of the modern rapture theory as we know it today.
So, back in the 1830s, Darby introduces this new concept of a pre-tribulation rapture. And here's the crucial part. From this perspective, this wasn't some long-held belief. It was a brand new theological framework that he basically developed.
So you might be wondering, how does an idea from the 1830s get so huge? Well, the analysis points to a few key cultural moments that made it go viral, so to speak. First, the Scofield Reference Bible introduced the theory to millions of everyday readers. Then, in the 1970s, a huge bestseller called The Late Great Planet Earth brought it to the masses. And of course, the wildly popular Left Behind book and movie series really sealed the deal, cementing it in our modern imagination.
Now, according to the source, this theory didn't just stay in books. Oh no. It also kicked off this recurring pattern of people making very specific and, as it turns out, very wrong predictions for when the world would end.
The analysis lays out a pretty clear historical pattern here. It goes way back to 1844, with something that literally became known as the Great Disappointment. The trend kept going through the 20th century, with folks like Charles Taze Russell and Harold Camping. And it's not over. The source even points to a recent prediction for 2025 that was making the rounds on TikTok. It just shows how these ideas keep adapting and spreading. So, to push back against this whole pattern of setting dates, the source goes directly back to Scripture, highlighting the phrase "no man know the hour" as a pretty clear instruction against trying to nail down a specific time.
Which brings us to the speaker's main diagnosis. Why? Why do these theories and these failed predictions keep getting so much traction? What's the real root of all this confusion?
The speaker we're examining frames this whole thing as a choice between two paths. Path number one is getting your information from basically unvetted sources, what he calls anybody on the internet. The other path, in his view, is to seek out knowledge from what he identifies as the teachers who are specifically designated in Scripture.
And he's not just pulling that out of thin air. He bases this argument on verses just like this one from Malachi, which suggests there's a specific, designated source you're supposed to go to for spiritual teaching and law.
So, to boil it all down, the speaker's core argument is this. There's so much confusion out there because people are learning from sources outside of what he sees as the proper authoritative channels that are laid out in the Bible. Okay, so if that's the diagnosis, what's the prescription? The last part of this analysis lays out what the speaker calls the proper foundation for actually understanding all of this.
And it presents this three-step path, and it's modeled on the biblical figure Ezra. First, you have to genuinely prepare your heart to seek the knowledge. Second, you can't just know it, you have to actually live it out, be a doer. And third, only after you understand it and you're doing it, can you then effectively teach it to others.
And finally, to give a really concrete alternative to that vanishing theory, the speaker uses a memorable analogy for the resurrection of the dead. He actually calls it the popcorn analogy. Okay, here's how it works. Imagine you're making popcorn in a hot pan on the stove. The pan is like the grave. The popcorn kernels are the dead.
Now, they don't all just vanish at the same time, right? Instead, they start popping one after another, really fast. Pop, pop, pop. In his view, that's a much better picture of the resurrection, a rapid, sequential rising from the dead, not an instantaneous disappearance of the living.
And all of this brings us to the final, really provocative question that this source leaves us with. And it's about way more than just the rapture. The deeper issue here is all about authority. In an age where you can get information from anywhere and everywhere, who do you trust to interpret these foundational texts, and why? That's really the big question to think about.